So now I shortly want to introduce our two keynote speakers who will open this more content-wise now. And we had thought that it would be a good idea to have somebody from research background and more from practice background. And it's now the first speaker will be Roman Gerodimos, who will talk about online youth civic attitudes. Roman, can you please come here? We also meet now the first time, at least in person. So we had only virtual communication. And the second speaker, hello, nice to meet you. And the second speaker will be Jutta Gläuber from Germany. Please also take a seat here. You can come here in a minute also too. Do you have a memory stick or something that we... Did you already? Okay. Okay, Roman is talking about online youth civic attitudes. He is a lecturer in global current affairs in the media school at the Bournemouth University in UK. And at the same time, he is also active he's a faculty member at the Salzburg Academy on Media and Global Change in Austria. Yes, that is correct. Okay, great. And the second speaker, I already introduced her, then I can sit down and relax when you are speaking. The second keynote speaker talking to us from a perspective of practice is Jutta Gläuber from Germany, and she will talk about open knowledge and net policy. Jutta is a project leader at the Open Knowledge Foundation in Germany, I guess Berlin, if I understood right. And her focus is on civic apps and open data, responsible for various projects in this foundation, but also more recently on a project that is called Code for Germany. I guess we will hear something about it or not. Yes, great. So, Roman.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who has worked so hard to put this really exciting program together. It's my first time in this space. It's a beautiful space, and I was just reading about some of its work yesterday, and I was wondering why we don't have something like that in every city, in every capital city of Europe. It would be amazing to have that. We could certainly use that. So I thought a lot about what I was going to say here, because whether I'm going to sort of go narrow or broad. First of all my friends were saying, oh, you're doing Keynote, you have to start with a joke. And I said, I have 20 minutes, I'm not going to do a joke, I'm going to be dead serious, so there's no jokes here. Just going to go straight into it. So what I'm going to start by doing is I'm going to briefly unpack or problematize the title, because I just want to sort of question or probe some of the assumptions we always make, or things we take for granted when we talk about youth participation. And that's probably the only thing we academics are good at, is sort of questioning words. And then, so that's sort of one thing I want to start with. And I'm probably pushing at an open door here, because you're all young, and those of you who are not so young are working with young people, so you probably agree with these things. But I think it's important to sort of have some reminders of why we're here, and maybe just question some of our assumptions. So the first thing I want to focus on is youth. And I just want to start by a provocative statement. Maybe it's not provocative, just say there's no such thing as one youth. And I'm saying this I'm directing this more to my own colleagues who are doing academic research, less so to people who are youth workers and work with young people every day, because they know that's the reality. But it is a common flaw of academic studies and some policy interventions to treat young people as one homogeneous group, and that's not true. So, I mean, the problem you get with that is, you know, these generalizations like digital natives. I mean, obviously, digital native is a phenomenon, but it doesn't mean that everybody who's young is a digital native, versus the diversity of the real youth communities across Europe. So I think it's important to mention that. And another problem that I established when I was sort of doing my research about youth initiatives is how a lot of people who are really well-intentioned try to look cool or be cool. And I'm not even talking about sort of elected politicians. I'm talking about even initiatives that have to do with empowering young people. And they're trying to approach young people, and maybe it's just, it doesn't work usually when you try to be something that you're not. So I thought that was also important to mention. And then one of the things that I've noticed, I've been in the various projects, some sort of Europe-wide, some more sort of local, and there's always this sort of need to find or reach across marginalized young people, and think tanks, universities, organizations. They're always sort of, we're always like parachuting into areas and saying, yeah, we need like this number of young people who take part in our study, and then who can approach them. And there's always this sort of strive to reach out, but it's not that easy. It's not something you can just parachute into an area and like sort of sample a few marginalized young people. It doesn't work like that. You need to build relationships. You need to empower people. It needs time, and it needs space, and it needs people on the ground. It needs to be grounded in reality. So I think that is one of the main challenges we're facing, both as researchers and as sort of more sort of policy-oriented practitioners, is how do you, by definition, marginalized people are not engaged, or they are disenfranchised, or they don't have a voice. So my approach is always, if it sounds like it's too easy, it's probably wrong, because you haven't approached the right people. Approaching truly marginalized people takes time, and it takes a lot of effort. So obviously there is a huge engagement infrastructure by the Youth Partnership, not least. But I suppose my broader call is to expand that and to nurture that and to ground it in real communities. So the final thing I want to say about this is cultural pluralism. I don't know about you, but when I was younger, one of the things that bugged me was that sort of hegemony of mainstream pop culture, and how, just like that is sort of spoon-fed to young people. And I suppose one of the things we need to nurture is cultural pluralism, which is so important to Europe. And part of not making assumptions is about that. So the second thing I want to sort of problematize is participation. And participation in what exactly are we talking about? So, and what for? Why is participation good? Is it because it's good on its own, like as a sort of an end of its own, or is it in order to achieve something? So do we view participation as the product or as a process? And we've seen the decline of traditional measures or traditional aspects of participation, like voting and membership and so on, and sort of the literature consensus is that we're seeing the rise of alternative forms of participation. What I found in my research anyway was that young people were much more likely to engage with specific issues, with specific aspects of participation that affected their daily lives, rather than with abstract concepts of participation. So they were more likely to engage with the product rather than the process. I'm not saying that, I'm not endorsing this, I'm not saying this is a good thing, I'm just saying this is what I found. So if we want to value participation as maybe something that has value on its own, then we need to think about why we want that. And it's not self-explanatory, we need to sort of communicate that. To an extent, there is a divide between issue-driven participation, what we perceive as our own interest, versus duty or public or collective forms of participation. There is that division to an extent. I think it's probably overstated, and I think that in itself is an ideological distinction. It's an artificial construction. It's not there in real life, but anyway, that's a different discussion. So the final point I want to make is about this is maybe not to be always so triumphant about all forms of participation or participation as a concept, because in a world where everybody participates or they think that they should participate at everything, my question is, where does this leave representation? And do we have the capacity, and do we need to participate in every single aspect of our lives? And I know that that's not what we're here about, but I wanted to put it out there because representation is important. Delegating to representatives and having that relationship between people who represent us is important, and I think that that is under threat. And obviously it's not young people's fault, it's part of a broader institutional sort of transformation. But I think that relationship between participation and representation is something that we'll sort of be coming back to. So finally, I mean, about participation, my point is, how do we communicate the value of participation? Well, it is the most efficient and the most civilized way of getting things done, and that's why participation is important. So, you know, if we just take it as granted and say participation is great, that's not very persuasive. If you actually explain that participation it works, it actually produces what you want, what you need, then I think that you're more likely to be successful. And then finally, which is my favorite, is the digital world. I've been doing this for 13 years and I still don't understand what that means. You know, what does the digital world even mean? I mean, there's no such thing as a digital world in a sense. Even more so today with the blurring of the boundaries of online and offline. Maybe the digital world made sense 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when you had niche communities of people who were very sort of homogeneous and doing one thing which was different and you couldn't find anywhere else. Now that we live in a sort of tethered self era where technology is embodied, it's everywhere, it's mobile, I don't think it makes that sense to be talking about a digital world anymore. And I think, to be honest with you, I think that's also an excuse for passing by some of the more material and physical questions about our needs. I mean, and this is a bit of a cheap shot, it's a bit populist to say, but if you're poor, you're not going to get rich by having bitcoins. If you're hungry, you're not going to, you know, what you need is like real bytes, not kilobytes. And then if you live in a really derelict sort of place, you're not going to, the quality of your life is not going to be transformed by having an amazing virtual reality experience. So, and I know that that's not what digital participation is about, but again, we tend to forget these things and we tend to hype up these notions of a digitalized, or a digital world. So my approach is obviously this online and digital technologies are everywhere and they're part of our lives and they are transforming the way we live and we work and we communicate and so on. But that's another layer in our existence, and it's always situated in physical realities in the material world. So, and what we need to start with is what forms of inequality are we trying to, what are the problems? We don't start with, oh, this is a great technology, how am I going to use this? It's what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and how can that technology help me solve the problem? So I think sometimes we just tend to start with sort of the other way around, rather the wrong questions. So it's about re-establishing agency of young people in this case, versus kind of like some sort of structure that is overpowering them, if you like. So in that sense, I think it's useful to have that as a starting point. And I know what I did was I deliberately misphrased the title, because that's not the title of the symposium. The title is In the Digitalized World, which I think is actually it's a tiny difference, but actually it's more important because it reflects that layering. We don't live in like a virtual reality, but we live in a world that has a digital aspect to it. So that's important. So then what I want to do briefly is just look at the 4 themes that the symposium is structured around, and look at one challenge that has to do with digitalization and young people. So in terms of communication, and obviously there's loads, and you're going to be talking about them over the next 3 days. I didn't want to cover all of them, just want to focus on one of them. So in terms of communication, what I feel is really important, and we don't talk a lot about, is the use of personalization algorithms and what Ellie Pariser called the filter bubble. I think it's a huge issue. I don't know how many of you have seen the video or how many of you have read the book or you know about the role of personalization algorithms, but basically if we search on Google about things, we're going to get different results. Facebook, Yahoo, all the major news online providers will tailor their content around what they think are your interests. And basically what you get is a fragmented, personalized experience that makes it increasingly more difficult to encounter ideas and thoughts and people that are outside of your mentality, outside of your comfort zone. And that has to do with encountering the other. And I think that's a fundamental challenge we need to tackle when we talk about digital media and young people. In terms of education, for me that's actually the most difficult of the 4 areas because we are talking about huge shifts in the relationship between the student and the teacher, and also in terms of what we understand by education, what we mean by education. There's a big debate, even in Britain at the moment, about reflective process versus the content of education, and about the relationship between teachers and students. So I think that sort of decline of authority and of hierarchies and the empowerment of the individual is affecting education, and the school reflects a reality, and it's a very tough environment for people. That is true. That reflects a reality that exists outside of the school. So there are various questions there in terms of how do you approach that? How do you actually ensure quality of education? How do you ensure both reflection and content? And I don't have the answers. I just thought I would put the questions up there because I think it's a really difficult area. In terms of digital literacy, I will say a few things later, but it's just important to emphasize that it's not just about the skills and the reflective process, which is really important to be able to learn how to learn, but it's also about content, and that's actually harder to focus on today. Economy, one area which I think is interesting is individualization, how even people who work as employees in huge corporations, we all have to now develop our own brand, and even more so people, excuse me, digital workers who go online and want to do their own things. Most of my students now basically are thinking their mentality is, I'm going to go online and I'm going to start my own thing. And what does that mean in terms of what are the implications of that? Obviously, it means you have an economy and a workforce which is much more flexible and creative and holistic, because they have to do their own PR, their own marketing, their own search engine optimization, even their own like human resources, collaborate and do their own finance and so on. So you've got people who, even from a very young age, can become more versatile, but what are the scale implications of not learning to work in large units with other people? And what about safety net? All the structures of support that are out there for traditional, let's call them traditional workers, are there for digital workers in terms of benefits, in terms of support, in terms of representation? And what about sort of even just the skills you get with working in an office with people or working in a sort of organization that has a corporate structure? What are the implications for people who will be sort of essentially freelancers or have their own business or market themselves? And what does that mean for competition in terms of privacy as well and skill sets? So all these are important questions. And essentially, I think what we need is more support mechanisms for digital workers, because otherwise what we are seeing is a generation of people who are going to go into work and they're not going to have any of the support mechanisms that sort of more conventional workforces had in the past. Finally, democracy, which is kind of like more sort of the area that I've been working on. We've seen globalization and digitization creating mobility, migration, and movement. And we all sort of experience that, especially in sort of people who are in this room are more likely to have experienced that first-hand or second-hand. And then we've also seen power diffusion, the fragmentation of the executive. Its sort of power is much more decentralized. Networks, decision-making networks are fragmented. It feels like that there isn't a single source of power or executive power, both in countries but also in Europe. So this comes with a lot of opportunities and participatory culture. It means that more people have more opportunities for mobility and for participation and for expressing their voice. It's a much more fluid, it's a much more pluralistic, it's a much more diverse reality, but it also comes with challenge. I don't want to talk about the good things because we can celebrate them, but it's important to talk about the challenges that brings. And I don't want to sound like I'm against mobility or migration or movement, because this is what is wonderful about Europe. But what are the sort of side effects that come with it? And we've seen them in every respect, even recently. Sort of sociocultural segregation and institutional detachment. Do people who are not invested necessarily in their local community, either because they are not given the opportunity or because they don't care, because they don't need to be. but also all sorts of democratic deficits and a sense of disconnect between citizens and decision makers. So these are sort of like the challenges of the civic culture. And what this leads to is basically crisis governance. You don't have effective mechanisms for decision making, and what you end up with is governments having to always manage crises and disasters and failures. And it feels like we live in a constant sort of era of crisis. I'm not being critical of governments for the decisions they make. What I'm saying is that there's a systemic issue that almost feels like there's not going to be any normalcy anymore, because you've got climate change and migration or refugee movements and the economic crisis and the euro and so on and so forth. And then it feels like that, you know, our life from now on is going to be just basically managing crises rather than having sort of what we thought was maybe a more sort of, you know, stable life. And that's maybe the new normal, and that's maybe what we need to get used to. But how do you make this democratically accountable? So my last slide is this, which has to do with, actually it's the penultimate slide, with drivers of online youth civic engagement based on some of the research I've done. And the research I did, as one of the speakers mentioned before, showed that young people can engage, they want to engage, they want to express their voice, but there are certain terms and conditions that they maybe even sort of subconsciously apply every time they face something that is civically interesting. And these are, first of all, that has to be relevant to their life world. It has to be relevant to me, my community, my family. It also has to give them a sense of efficacy. So why should I participate? So there needs to be kind of like a tangible product or sort of measure of change at the end of it. Otherwise, they don't feel the motivation to participate. Third aspect was it needs to be emotionally engaging. And I think that's one of the maybe one of the aspects of engagement that the European Union in particular has maybe overlooked or has not paid enough attention in the past. The symbolic, the affective aspects of engagement. And when you have a vacuum of an emotional engagement, that will be filled by all sorts of other extremists and people who are much better at sort of populist rhetoric. And then finally, that sort of visual communication online, because what my research was about civic websites, NGO websites, youth websites, and the level of visual engagement and how beautiful or gripping or elegant the material needs to be is still, I mean, this research is a few years old, but it's amazing that these lessons haven't been incorporated yet. That sort of people still think that these are somehow new, but this has been there all the time. It's like you need to have a really good visual product for people to engage. Otherwise, within milliseconds, you're going to be ignored. So I just want to show you one quote because I thought that was totally typical of some of the responses I got. And it says, so the question was, what would motivate you? What would motivate you if you saw it on a website? What would you need to see to be motivated? And one of them was showing visitors the difference it could make by taking action, by showing the consumer the little effort it would cost them to change their behavior and the huge impact it would have on the issue if they did. So give me examples of how I can easily, non-time consumingly make an impact already without spending too much money. These are quotes from my interviewees. What's the problem with these quotes? I mean, am I the only one who thinks that there is a problem there? Participation by the individual won't always make a huge difference. Probably, likelihood is it won't make any sort of discernible difference. It's the aggregate of, I mean, it may do, but it's the aggregate of people's participation that usually makes lasting difference. And there is an issue there about that attitude towards participation, that it's about essentially about me and change in my life world. Having said that, I have seen a lot of young people in my classes and in my research engage with global issues that are very remote from their locality if that is done in a sort of visually arresting and emotionally engaging way. So it's not, my message is not one of sort of pessimism, it's one of caution about the tools that we need to use. So literally the final slide is sort of an agenda, if you like, what I see as the main guidelines in terms of where we need to move. global engagement, very important at every level, institutional level, sort of emotional level, opportunities for intercultural dialogue, and that's one of the most potent ways of encountering the other and so being politically socialized. Addressing specific and material inequalities, so start with the problem and then find the means and the processes around it. Digital literacy, incorporating things that people can associate in their daily lives like play, games, and all that situated in physical space. And then nurturing the civic culture, and by civic culture I mean all the things that sort of make us coexist with each other in public space, in sort of civic space. And yeah, it's just to close by saying that the last time I was in Budapest was 33 years ago. I'm not 100 years old, I was 6 at the time, and then but I still remember it. And my parents used to take us through these long car journeys through Europe, Cold War Europe, and sort of I come from Greece, so it was a long journey, and it was a very different Europe at the time, right? And just traveling through Europe by car and being stopped at every border, and you know, checks that would go on for hours, and like every policeman, usually it was a policeman, being able to just stop you and like search and do whatever they wanted, basically, because they had that power, that authority that was given to them by sort of a system. And it's so different to what happened afterwards and to where we got to. And you know, yesterday as I was landing in Budapest, I heard that Germany obviously introduced some border controls, and that there is all these situations facing Europe today. And I'm thinking we don't really want to go back to a situation where there were borders, and there were, I mean, mobility is really important. And Erasmus has done more for the European Union and young people than any other sort of initiative, because it is that real experience of being there and meeting people and getting to know places. So I suppose, you know, it's all about, yeah, okay, it's digital, but also it's about those core values that are really central to what the EU and the content is about. So final thing to just say, tomorrow evening I'm going to be screening these short films, hopefully, which are like a more artistic, creative take on the things that I've talked about today. And if there is any time left, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Roman, for these insights in not only in the 4 topics that we will discuss during the symposium, but also in general terms on the very relevant issues of youth participation and also civic engagement of young people, etc. I invite you now to ask questions if anything was open to you, where you need some further information, or if you have any comment on what you heard. So everything's... please, yeah.
So my name is Pierre Bosser. I'm a co-founder of a startup called Interns GoPro. So I know quite well as well the digital world, and we are working as well how we can enable people to participate to fix social issue. My question for the 2 panelists is, okay, we have a problem as well how to fix politics. Yeah, we see that people are more or less and less inclined to really engage with politics. So do you think actually it's only a problem of participation, and with only the digital tools that can force that, or it is something more profound? Yeah, that's a problem. Do you think the participation through the digital tool can fix politics? This is the question, actually. The big.
And the question goes for? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Good. Yeah, no, I think it's, I mean, without going on about it for too long, I think you need to define your problem first. And if by, you know, not participating in politics, we mean, you know, not voting, not maybe distrusting politicians and all these measures, I think, I don't think necessarily that digital tools can deal with the root cause of the problem, which is a shift in our perceptions of hierarchies or of decision-making, the role of decision-makers. You know, who is qualified to make decisions for me. So the more we know, the more transparency there is, and the more we know about the way decisions are made and compromises and so on, I think it brings a lot of good things with it. It brings more transparency, it brings more protection and human rights and civil liberties, but at the same time it also brings less trust. So I think the phenomena we're seeing, the decline of traditional politics, is part of broader trends to do with a more liberal and more pluralistic and more distributed or diffused model of politics. So how do you deal with it? I think you need to, I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle. I don't think you can go back into a model of politics as we knew it, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But you do need to create new institutions at different layers. So I think you need an approach which works at the global level, where there's a huge problem of lack of global governance and citizenship. You need at the national level, you need at the local level, so you need a multi-pronged approach, and digital media can be a tool. I don't think, and they can be a very empowering tool, but it's just, I don't think there are easy fixes there, and I don't think we're going to see a dramatic improvement. It is a matter of mentalities, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that digital tools can fix politics either, but I think that some of the digital tools can put information into the hands of citizens so that they have arguments and a foundation for discussions, and also a foundation a foundation of knowledge so that they can vote and express themselves on. And what I see with the programs that we are running is that it's very important to give politicians and also people within the public administration the chance to tap into networks. In some cities, people are very eager to come to meetups with the Jugendhakt kids or Code for Germany. So sometimes there's just, I get the feeling, a lack of opportunity to communicate and connect. And when we're talking about open data, I think it's very important to build best practices, to have arguments on why we need to open up more information and data.
Hello, Martin Fischer from Game Over Hate. Thank you for your inputs, especially like the second one. Big fan of Jugendhakt. I wanted to ask, because especially the first speaker was quite insistent that there's no such thing as a digital world. And I think in the second presentation, there were a lot of examples where, what many people might call hacktivism does a lot of change by tools that in the offline world or the non-digital world would not be applicable. And I wanted to ask the both of you if there is, if you do believe that there might be different forms of participation that have not existed in the offline world now through the development of such tools, and if we need to revisit what we understand as participation due to the change that brings digital communication and digital just life out there. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for the question. Just to clarify, I mean, and maybe that didn't sort of come out very clearly, I don't mean that there isn't, I don't mean there isn't a digital, digital practice or digital spaces or digital activities or, the internet. But what I mean is there isn't a digital world which is in a vacuum, that it's purely digital, that you can step into a digital universe that is just somehow decontextualized out of a physical or material reality. Even the dark web is situated in people's bedrooms or basements or somewhere, and it has real implications. And hate speech online is not a digital phenomenon. It hurts people in real terms. So what I'm trying to say is that the digital and the physical are intertwined, and there is no such thing as a purely digital world. But the second point of your question about how that is transforming participation, I agree. I mean, I agree that it doesn't mean that there's necessarily, again, completely new forms that we've never seen before. Maybe there are evolutions of previous forms of participation, or maybe the seeds in terms of our motivations and our needs and our political socialization are the same, but that gets expressed differently online, and we definitely need to change, and we are changing our practice in politics and democracy and so on to address these. But I just don't think that there's this entirely different, separate reality out there that you step into, and it's sort of a utopia or dystopia or just something else. I think it's all. I'm not saying it's all physical, but it's definitely intertwined with the physical. I think that's my point.
I think the main advantage of the internet is that you can, or the two main advantages is that you can reach a very broad audience, or that you have a certain reach, and that, as I mentioned, that you can become a creator and you don't need a lot. You need skills and a computer, and you also don't have to wait. Via access to knowledge, you don't have to wait until your school teaches you how to program. You can just go online and study courses and learn it yourself. And that's also what we see at Jugendhack, that the teenagers arrive and they already have basic coding skills, but they didn't learn it at school. They learned it by themselves. But I also think, and I want to emphasize that when we're talking about online versus offline, that it's really about the problem you're trying to approach and solve. Sometimes a poster campaign might have the same effects or even better effects than a Facebook campaign. If it's your local neighborhood you want to inform, you might go for the posters, and you might not want to start a new platform or a new tool. But yeah, you start with simple paper prototypes and check what's the easiest thing to approach a certain problem. So yeah, I think it's a good mix of both, and asking about what problem and what target group am I trying to reach and what am I trying to solve.
And continue your thought and to what we're saying before, I think if you think of, say, political parties as mechanisms of aggregation of people's voice and interest and so on, what you're seeing online is very different ways of aggregating people's voices and interests and needs and so on. So essentially, in terms of aggregating that voice and communicating that, it is, I'm not saying that the internet or digital spaces or digital initiatives or hackathon will replace political parties, but they are alternative and complementary ways of aggregating voice, and that can have a lot of different reach than physical, purely physical means might do. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
And what I also find interesting is that the internet opens you the doors to the world. But most of the citizen or most of the participation projects are very local. So people care about their neighborhood, their city. A lot of the tools that the young people build have a direct focus on their daily life, and they really care about local issues.
My name is Vadim. First question to both speakers about drivers of online youth civic engagement. As I understand, you try to underline something specific for online youth participation, or because a lot of them circle around me, my family, community. I remember since Ladder of Participation-based book 20 years ago. Yeah. Do you think that this is just the same trend in digitalized world, or you can underline 2 or 3 drivers which are really new, according to your research and your experience, Julia? Yeah. This is first question, and if it's possible, a small one. Second question about economy. Your page about economy with a lot of text. Do you think it is a background, behavior for development of such thing as social investment, social entrepreneurship among young people? You had your page with a lot of tags. New tags, I hope you remember. Yeah. Do you think are they useful for the development of social investment and social entrepreneurship among young people? I hope I am understandable. If not, I will ask you at the coffee break. Thank you.
So in terms of your first question, I think that the broader trends, the broader drivers, they're not per se about technology, they're broader. And I think technology, what it does is it facilitates, it's a model based around user choice, right? And that basically makes it easier for us to seek solutions or spaces or ideas that we feel are more compatible with what we need. So I don't think there is something fundamentally new about the motivators or the drivers of how we behave online. That is not to say that the outcomes are not new, but the actual drivers, I think, are all about human nature. It's technology just facilitates it, it makes it more difficult or whatever, but the actual drivers, I don't think they're new. The second question, if I got it right, you were talking about the economy page, right? And how individualism, and I think you're right that there, you have seen crowdfunding and social entrepreneurship and a lot of exciting initiatives, and I think that does make it easier maybe than collaborative models in the past. It would have been much more hierarchical and difficult to have maybe these models. So in that respect, it's good. It's just about who has the knowledge and the skills and the expertise to create that brand or that campaign or that cause that will be successful, because many people may want to do that, but the thing is, who has the knowledge of how to engage audiences online that will allow them to use that? Is there parity in how people can use that, or do you see new elites or new gatekeepers or new experts or new people who have basically new inequalities that may be different from the old inequalities, but they're still inequalities?
Yeah, I have not much to add on that.
Thank you.
My name is Oleg Dmitriev. I'm from High School of Economics in Moscow and Sputnik News Agency. So in addition to what has been already discussed, so for many years, the objective for many media outlets and internet outlets has been the creation of the community. So how do we go beyond that? So is that still the case when we talk about youth participation in a digitalized world, or is there a broader perspective to the issue? Thank you.
It's quite a huge question. Yeah, so I think a community is the community is a vessel that within which interaction takes place, within which decision making takes place, socialization takes place. I don't think you can do away with a community in the same way that you can't do away with space or with other things. The question is, what are the boundaries of that community? Do you make it an inclusive community or exclusive? Do you make it fair and just, or do you make it like a place where there's a lot of horrible things happening? So in terms of the media, creating sort of imagined or otherwise communities, obviously the media, different media, even online, different websites, different communicators and influencers are very aware of their audience or their targeted audience, and they're trying to occasionally, either for profit or for attention and sort of self-presentation, reach that audience. I don't necessarily think that everybody has that sort of benign idea of, oh, let's create a nice Habermas in public sphere so they can have like nice discussion. It's usually I want to make money, or I want to be like famous, or I want to do something, and maybe the part of the agenda is actually, okay, let's try to serve the public interest if we can. So there's loads of different motivations. Community is one of them. But I think even in terms of really complex global or huge global networks and media, you still have communities of followers or of interest. And yeah, I don't think you can have a sort of a space which is not characterized by some form of community. It just gets, I think it sort of forms around the medium, if you like.
Yeah, communities are at the core of everything we do. And I think the interesting question is, how do we manage to connect different communities to each other? And how do we manage to build platforms or to help people to grow communities and to spread out? So yeah, I think communities are an essential part of our work. Like basically, like what we do in these two projects, we help to build communities and a network. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Antonio, founder of Economia Creativa Consultancy. I like very much a point you raised, like the digital world at some point can be kind of excuse to bypass physical needs and this kind of thing. So I would like to ask you what kind of solutions can be for this, or for example, like the basic income, or what kind of other solutions for improving representation of the individual workers, freelance, etc., like it's now very fashion. And I can, from the point of view academic, and from the point of view of the activism, etc. Thank you.
I mean, I don't want to go into specific policies or specific solutions for specific areas, because I'm not necessarily the best expert, or that's not necessarily the scope of this. But what I want to say is that we should, I suppose my point is we should keep the goal in mind when we talk about digital empowerment, or when we talk about digital tools, and the implications of, okay, you create this new app or this new tool or this new space, but what are the material and physical implications? Does this actually redress some of the imbalances or inequalities? So I guess the point I'm trying to make is how you measure or how you evaluate the physical or spatial or material outcome of your digital initiatives. So as long as they're not just virtual and, you know, like somewhere in a piece of paper or in an Excel spreadsheet, but they actually give people the opportunity to change their lives. So you could have a digital, you know, there's a lot of work around entrepreneurship online, and obviously a lot of that is happening here. So I suppose the point is, as long as you remember that people maybe need spaces so that they can go in and do their work, because they may not have the opportunity to do it at home. It's not just enough to have a perfect website if people don't have the means to actually go and use that website. It's not just enough to have a perfect, you know, virtual theatrical experience, to use it. And another example, it's good to have that, but you still need that physical one-to-one interaction, that visit to that space. So it's, I suppose the point is, you need both. It's not just enough to have, and we shouldn't shy away from, and it's much harder to deal with, you know, problems in the real world than it is to have like a virtual angle to them, I suppose. It's just, it's keeping that in mind, which is an important thing, you know?
Yeah, I'm afraid I think I have to leave this the answer to this question to experts who are more knowledgeable on this field. But like one thought maybe on that, I'm working on a new project where I'm trying, because most of the things people create are prototypes, so how can we take those prototypes a step further? How can we encourage people to maybe start startups or become freelancers and really like build civic tech products that work and that are not just prototypes? And I'm right now working on a prototype fund. There's a prototype fund by the Knight Foundation in the US, which is working really well to like seed fund small projects, and that might be a next step for a lot of the developments that come from the community to take them to the next level. But I know that's not an answer to your question, just another thought on it.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan van Eer. I'm coming from the CDG and the Youth Working Party from Flanders, Belgium. Thanks for your excellent contribution to this symposium. My question is a concern. What can we do from the side of the ministries, the governance, and what has youth services to do to increase youth participation today? What are for you cardinal points, key points to keep in mind to stimulate youth participation?
I think I have a couple of answers to that question. God, is that the microphone? Yeah. Sorry. That was the enthusiasm.
That was his wake-up call.
So my first advice would be open your doors. Invite people, start round tables. That's something that one of the federal states in Germany just started doing to start round table discussions. It's not a super innovative new format, but it's a very good format for direct interaction and behind the scenes talks. So inviting people from the civic tech communities or specific communities to talk about one topic or issue. In the field where I'm working, we're talking a lot about open data. So what data sets does the community want to have? Under what are the technical details that have to be taken in account when the data sets are opened up? And there's this one other idea for ministry I'm a big fan of. It's a fellowship. Why not invite young people or also adults into the ministry for a year to work with units within the ministry to tackle certain problems, very specific problems, to also unveil problems and to show what's possible with technologies, to give some insights. I mentioned it in the keynote, the Presidential Innovation Fellowships of the White House, where President Obama invites the most forward-thinking tech people for 1 year to work with him and to tackle important problems and to see, okay, what technologies can be used and what's the stake of the community. And those people only stay for a year. After this year, they move on, they go to big software companies. But for this 1 year, the ministry, or the White House in this case, has all this knowledge and can tap into that knowledge. So those would be two very concrete things. To open up, to invite people, and to start with the offline engagement, I think.
That's a great question, thank you. What I would say is if you want to change perceptions of politics or of institutions, one thing is to try to keep it simple and build a campaign that is extrovert, that is simple, that people can emotionally engage with. But also what I would say is empower and invest in youth workers and sort of continue to build that infrastructure of engagement with marginalized communities over time. So it has to be much more localized. It has to be about giving local communities the spaces and the people that they need in order to reach out to young people. You can't just have one thing that lots of different initiatives can cause change, but if you're talking about reaching out people who are not already engaged, you need that time, and you need the people who are going to be in the community and who know their areas and the people well and the needs to invest in them so that they can reach out even further. But I also think it is important to have that brand. Erasmus, everybody knows Erasmus, even people who haven't gone on Erasmus, and they know how great it is, because it is that experience, first-hand experience of having gone to a different country and meeting other young people. Nothing can replace face-to-face interaction across borders. So I would say just invest more in that.
Roman and Jutta for these insights. I think that was a good kickoff for our discussions in the next days. I take two issues personally with me. One is last year, one of the results of our project on youth participation, and especially the project Amplify Youth Participation, also done by Jugend für Europa in Germany, was that we would promote a youth takeover day. So Jutta is even much more advanced. She's talking about a takeover year. So that would be probably an alternative or an enlargement of this dimension. So that another issue that I want to encourage you now. She was also talking about the need to build communities, online and offline, and I invite you now to build communities in the coffee break. Thank you very much.